I am now joined by Congressman Neal Dunn, a Republican from Florida. He is a doctor and a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Welcome, Congressman. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Bob. Appreciate it.
Let's start out. A lot to discuss on this topic and different agencies working on it. But big picture, where are we in the fight against Alzheimer's, and where do we need to go?
So there's actually a lot of promising news out there. There's probably 20 or 30 drugs that are working their way through the pipeline and are in either phase 3 or 2 trials. Some are still in phase 1. But honestly, there's a lot of promise out there. So I think something is going to come across the finish line soon. The first one to make it across is, of course, aducanumab, or it's sold under the name Aduhelm. So that was the first one, and it muddied the waters because it had a very abnormal approval process.
Right, very controversial. What do you think is the best way to approach it as far as both FDA and the approval process, as well as CMS, which is equally as important on the reimbursement side?
Yeah, so, traditionally everybody thinks if the FDA approves it, CMS is going to pay for it, cover it. And that's become the expectation. It's the CMS has in fact started sort of walking that back with a number of processes that they've instituted. They call them coverage with evidence, CETs, evidence determination. So, but it's oftentimes they're using that honestly, for control of prices and cost rather than really evidence. However, I would say in this particular case, they have such an abnormal approval process through the FDA that it really looks like this is the problem that the CMS has is actually they have some doubts whether this drug should have been approved. And so they're kind of substituting their rules for what the FDA does. And that's really tough because CMS isn't designed to do that. They don't really have the wherewithal or expertise to run the trials and evaluate the trials the way the FDA does, even though one could argue the FDA dropped the ball this time.
As far as Aduhelm and other treatments down the line, you have to look at the fiscal situation of Medicare, and of course Alzheimer's is so expensive without a cure. But how do policymakers have to really balance both cost and approval and making sure people get the care they need, but it's also worthy of government dollars, especially when you have the nation's debt limit at its highest ever?
So I think you separate those functions. You've got FDA saying, is it efficacious? Is it safe? And then, you've got CMS that comes along and says, this price is acceptable or it's not to society at large. And you will notice that actually the company that makes this drug, Biogen, actually cut the price in half because of the controversy, the public outcry, if you will, after it was introduced. Still a very expensive drug, but as you mentioned, Alzheimer's is expensive, untreated too, very expensive. So there's a lot of balancing there. I would say that you don't want FDA to be thinking about price. You don't want CMS thinking about, is the drug any darn good? You'd like to know, before the CMS gets involved, you want them to know that they've got a drug that's safe and efficacious, or if it's only borderline, how borderline it is. And by conflating those two responsibilities, I think we've really confused what we've lost here is public confidence. And, public confidence in federal health authorities is already at a record low all time. And when we have fumbles like this, we lower their confidence even further. And, that's a lot of damage to be done to public confidence.
I really enjoy talking to doctors who serve in Congress to get their perspective on what does Washington not get that real doctors like you come to Washington and say, you've got to understand this. It could be a couple of things, but what have you seen as a disconnect?
So one of the most common lectures I give to young doctors when I go on grand rounds and whatnot now still is to say, listen, when you go to that patient's bedside, you're there to help that patient. You're not there to practice public policy. If you want to practice public policy, you come to Washington or go to your state capital. But do not practice public policy at the bedside. That's not your job there. You're supposed to save that patient. And so it really is a very big disconnect from being a doctor where, I want to save every patient I come across. But you come up here and you say, I want to save every patient I come across. Well, I've only got, several $100 billion to do it. And there's a lot of patients. So that's a different trade-off. And that's one that we have to understand as a society, but it's not one that should be done at the bedside.
What's the role of stakeholders here? I mean, everybody wants a cure, better treatments that are affordable. Those are all difficult things. Everybody wants to spur innovation, but also regulate it so it's safe. Yeah, how can the stakeholders and really Democrats and Republicans who have, in your committee, have competing legislation and kind of tackling this issue? How can kind of people get to the goal and keep the partisan politics aside?
So I think let's start with counting the stakeholders, because we think there's a lot of Alzheimer's patients, and there are. But this amyloid deposits, amyloid plaque deposits on neurons in the brain actually characterize a number of common ailments. Down syndrome jumps to mind. Traumatic brain injury jumps to mind. Even PTSD has been implicated with amyloid plaque deposition. So you have a huge population of patients, families, veterans who are desperate to get to these drugs. And they had been trained over the years to believe that if the FDA approves a drug, it's safe, it's efficacious, and that CMS would cover it. And now we find that CMS isn't going to cover very much of it at the front end, at least. And we also have reason to doubt both the efficacy and the safety profile of this drug. So we are really in a little bit of untraveled waters.
And speaking of those waters, we're in a COVID time. We're not doing events yet back in person. Certainly, what have we learned? We've learned a lot from the COVID-19 times. What have we learned as far as it relates to Alzheimer's and innovation? We have vaccines that were made in record time historically, and obviously it hasn't been a panacea, but it certainly helped.
So you're right. So, I mean, that Operation Warp Speed, where they took the approval process, instead of it wasn't siloed. You had to go through this hoop, this hoop, this hoop, this hoop. But instead of doing them one sequentially, you could do them all simultaneously. It makes sense. It's an expensive way to do it. But we had to do that during that pandemic. I would say we did some really good things with that kind of deregulation. It's not deregulation. It's just streamlining the regulation. But we also missed some things. And so that's really where I'd like to see NIH, FDA, CDC get together and say, okay, we can do this, but we can do it better. We can make better choices, because we dropped the ball on the choices of therapeutics, and we dropped the ball on some of the choices of diagnostics and even surveillance programs for SARS-CoV-2. And the next pandemic, whatever that was going to be. So, and we could learn from our mistakes. Unfortunately, by mandating a lot of things, and we've known this forever, this isn't a surprise. When you mandate vaccines, when you mandate almost anything in health, you get an inversion of uptake. That means the public believes you less, they trust you less when you tell them they have to do it. Much better to convince them that it's the right thing to do. And we've known that forever. You can't find a textbook that says make a mandate. It doesn't happen.
Congressman, Doctor, really appreciate your thoughts. Enjoyed the conversation today.
Anytime, Bob. Thanks so much.
Well, that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to the Alzheimer's Association for its support, and to all of you attendees for joining us for this discussion. For those of you who may have missed any of the conversations, video from the event will be up on our website shortly. I'm Bob Cusack. Have a great day.